Welcome to the stage, Carlos. Stage is yours. Enjoy yourself.
All right, guys. Really excited to be in Slovenia. It's one of my favorite places in the world. Lake Bled, one of my particular favorites. I know it's a bit of an Instagram cliche, but I love it. And so when Urban said, "Hey, do you want to come over for this talk?" I was like, "Hell yes! Of course I want to come." And then there was a condition, was that I had to give a talk about this. And it was a bit of a daunting subject because I was thinking, well, wait a second, this is like one of those topic roulettes where you're like, let's just pick a random subject, put two things together and see what comes out. So ICOs changed everything and nothing at the same time. And I was debating pushing back on him and saying, hey mate, I don't want to do this, or at least not this subject. But then I decided, you know what, fuck it, challenge accepted. So hopefully this makes sense. Before I talk more about that, I want to talk a little bit about who I am, what we do. How many of you have heard of Seedcamp through your, do the sound thing. How many of you are actively raising money at the moment? Okay, not as much as you think, okay. So Seedcamp's an early stage fund based in London. A little late to the game, huh? All right, let's be mature about these things, okay? So Seedcamp's an early stage fund based in London. We've backed over 270 companies, all pre-Series A. Some of the companies you might use on your day-to-day, like TransferWise and Revolut. And we look for founders no matter where they are. We've made a lot of investments in this region. We love the founders from Romania, from Slovenia, Estonia, and of course, Western Europe. And we've even invested as far as Hong Kong. And what we're looking for is people who have global ambitions. So if you feel like that describes you, just go to our website. It explains the process of how to get in touch with us. But one of the interesting things about our new fund, which we made an announcement of in November, is that we can now invest in tokens. I think we're the first LPGP. I know that's a bit sort of fund-to-fund technical jargon, but we're the first that can invest in tokens directly. And we can talk a little bit about that offline or maybe during the panel. So let's go back to this idea of ICO versus a traditional fundraise. And I'm going to juxtapose a traditional fundraise with a ICO over the course of the rest of the conversation. So just to define the two things, one, I'm going to treat an ICO as traditional sort of media headline, people who raise through a token offering somewhere in excess of like 30 million all at one go. So that's what I'm going to usually refer to as an ICO. And a fundraise, I'm referring to a traditional VC type fundraise where you raise a seed round, then a Series A round, then a Series B round. And so we're going to take all the elements of both and see how they affect each other. But more importantly, we're going to take some of the things about the traditional VC fundraise model, which might make its way into the traditional ICO model because it just made sense the first time around. One of the key things is it's not all about the money. So one of my ex-colleagues, Ivan Fernetti, had this quote that went, "The main job of a CEO is to raise money and to hire and attract the best people." And with an ICO, you raise all that money up front, so to some extent, we can get rid of the first half of this question. The first half of this problem is addressed with having raised all that money up front. So the challenges of having to go out to the market and talk about your strategy, talk about your progress, has been eliminated. Now, it's mostly about retaining and hiring people. So let's look at what the ICO did not change. There's a laundry list of things that I think make up the bulk of the problems that most companies have, no matter what, no matter how much money they have. The 5 things are setting the right tone and culture, finding and attracting the right people, engaging with customers, setting the right goals and milestones, and of course, bringing on the right advisors or investors. And we're going to go through each one of these in the lens of both ICOs and fundraises. So let's start off with finding and keeping the right people. One of the critical things that I've noticed have killed companies over a period of time is this idea of two founders not agreeing on something. One of the things that I deal with in most companies before the first year is disputes between the founders about what they want to do, what their vision was, and unfortunately, it is the biggest cause of company death. Now, if you can get culture down, it helps align a lot of things. Not only does it help align everything from how people interact, but it helps smoothen out arguments and inspires people to do more. And that doesn't matter how much money you've raised. One of the interesting things about ICOs is that they enabled you to raise all this money up front. And that is a double-edged sword. For example, the typical company that is successful raises $41 million before an exit. With an ICO, you can probably raise that all at one go. But that doesn't overcome some of these people challenges. You could literally find yourself rich with cash, but not rich with culture, not rich with an employee value system that everyone's happy to work around. So you can find yourself in a very immature situation very quickly, which means you have a hard time hiring some of the best talent. We have a podcast. It's on podcast.seedcamp.com. I will show it to you at the end of the slides. But tomorrow we're going to be publishing the podcast of my interview with John Wood, the author of Purpose Incorporated. He's also the founder of the Room to Read charity. You might have heard of Tech Bikers. Tech Bikers is an initiative to help fund Room to Read. So listen into the podcast tomorrow. Now, what he talks about is the need for purpose in an organization for it to be successful. And the interesting thing about that is if you have a purpose, and that purpose is really clear to the people who are joining you, they will out-labor and they will out-maneuver and they will out-innovate companies that don't have that. Because more and more people, especially younger generations, are looking for that as a reason to join a company, far more than ever before. Once you attract those A people, those people hire A people. You've heard the term A people hire A people, but B people hire C people. Well, if you don't get this sorted out, you will likely find yourself in a situation where you're cash rich, but culture or employee poor. And that's one of the challenges that doesn't get solved by having all this money up front. Another issue that doesn't get solved with money is diversity. Because of the way that ICOs are raised, it involves a very select group of people that almost always have an echo chamber. They all kind of aggregate in the same area. And there's even Crypto Valley in Zug, right? There's going to be a certain type of person that gravitates towards an ICO type company versus, let's say, a traditional company might start anywhere because of the regulatory hurdles of running an ICO. And as a consequence of that, your diversity in the organization might be impacted. I'll tell you a story about diversity. I went to this training by a partner organization called Diversity VC about 5 weeks ago. And one of the exercises they made us do was they split us up into 3 groups, and they gave us a budget. And the budget was we could buy civil rights for a society that we wanted to build. So we were given a list of like 50 civil rights. We were given a budget. Each group was giving a separate budget. And with that budget, mine was $1,000, we could buy civil rights off of this list of 50. Each civil right cost a certain amount of money. One civil right was like the ability to walk down the street without getting mugged. And so that meant that you needed to make decisions about which one of these things was most important for you. So my group was 3 men, the next group was 2 women and 1 man, and the next group was 2 men and a woman. Our group sat down and looked at the list and decided that the most important thing in our society, fictional society, would be safety. That we would want to live in a society where we could walk down the street and not get mugged. And so we picked a lot of things that resembled that. Everything from making sure that if somebody was convicted of a criminal act, they'd be fairly judged, everything to, as I mentioned earlier, being safe just in the day-to-day. When the time came to sort of share what we had picked, we had a completely different list than the group that had 2 women and a guy. The group, the one that stood out for me the most was the group that had 2 women and a guy picked as their number 1 civil right, the ability for a woman to retain her job after leaving for maternity leave. And that was a very interesting outcome, you know, like they had ignored the one about walking down the street safely and instead chosen the ability to be able to have your job back when you come back from maternity leave. So we asked them why they chose that. And they said, well, it's because if you're living in a society where that is happening, you most likely already solved the security issue. And that was a really interesting insight as to how different groups can think entirely different things, even though when you're in a group, you think you're giving it your most logical outcome. And so having a lot of money doesn't necessarily mean that you're automatically going to be able to have the best team or the most diverse team. So that's another problem that money doesn't solve. And of course, another big problem is typically whenever a company fundraises and it goes through phases, it also gives a chance for the organization to attract talent at different phases of the organization and maps to what other people understand an organization's maturity is. For example, there are people who will only join a company once they've raised a Series B. Why? Because they understand that there's a lot of organizational maturity that has formed, and therefore it's the time for them to come in. So if you are an advisor, you might not want to engage with a company until it's a little bit more mature. And so one of the problems that creates is that you might have your initial team have a CTO, a COO, and all these people are not capable of scaling up to their roles that would have normally happened 2 or 3 funding rounds later. Instead, you're stuck with having to fire your CTO because they're not scaling as well, rather than just starting off with head of product and moving their way up, and then having somebody else in a Series B come in as CTO. So these things also affect it. The next one is driving customer satisfaction. So whenever you've raised all this money, you might get tempted to just work on what you said you were going to work on and lose track of having to engage with your customer frequently. You might lose track of having to build a commonality of purpose around, not just internally with your employees, but externally with your customers. There was a couple of studies that demonstrated that value-driven organizations outperform those that weren't. So for example, based on employee interviews, a study found that 99% of value-based organizations had reported very satisfied customers compared with 42% of respondents in organizations typical of top-down command control. In another one of publicly traded values-based companies, they returned 750% over 10 years, while the average market just performed 128% return. And in a CSR study by Cone Communications, 87% of customers said that they would purchase a product because the company that advocated it had something that they cared about, versus 75% would be willing to not buy a product because they disagreed on the ethics of it. And so the temptation here is when you have all this money and when you've raised it up front, some of these issues fall by the wayside because you're not thinking on them at the same time that you're thinking about your product development and engaging with customers again and again. Another way that this maps out is in how you set milestones and goals for your company. So traditionally in a fundraise, you have milestones mapped to your fundraises. It's not unusual that you raise money for 18 months, for example, and then you go fundraising at your 12 months, you tell what you did, what you achieved, you raise more money at a higher valuation, and so forth. So what happens to that if that gets eliminated, if you raise all the money up front? As I mentioned, the typical company raises 41 million if they're successful. And what happens if you just receive it all up front? Well, does that mean that your pace of development changes? Does that mean that potentially you hire all the people up front to build this company and this product far faster than your ability to mature? I wrote a blog post about some of the 5 challenges of scaling an organization. I interviewed a lot of growth stage companies, and all the problems were people problems. About how do you take organizational control from the founding team onto the next team, which then creates sub-teams, and then the next team, and how do you divide and how do you change the responsibility matrix across the organization? So how do you do that if you spend all of it up front, faster than you can possibly comprehend as the founding team, faster than you can process it? So are you just going to hire and accelerate your product development roadmap? What if it's the wrong product? And so some of these things mean that you might end up having to manage the ICO cash in a way that resembles traditional VC rounds. It might be that we end up in a position where, yes, you raise this money in ICO, but you can only draw it down in tranches or something equivalent to map to these best practices that the world of venture fundraising has shown is probably sometimes a better way of doing milestone development. And I'm happy to talk about the merits or not merits of that when we're having the panel. But another issue that this brings up is if you are given 41 million up front, now you have the challenge of being a fund manager at the same time. What if inflation erodes the value of that 41 million? Are you at fault as a CEO for doing that? So these are all additional challenges that it brings up. Another point of complexity that brings up is how do you bring on the right advisors? So I had to go fundraising for our fund, and I got rejected just as much as startups get rejected when they go fundraising. But some of those meetings that I had were really, really good because they gave me insight as to how that investor thought and why we were not the right fit for them. With an ICO, I wouldn't get any of that. And not only that, it would strip me of some valuable relationships and would strip me of the ability to connect with them in ways that then allows me to connect with new people that are part of their network. Some of the best referrals I've gotten were from people who rejected us for our fundraise. So I'm completely eliminating myself from that. But at the same time, I'm also making it more difficult for traditional investors with lots of experience to invest in me because they are not part of that workflow at the moment. And then separate to that, you're creating incentive structures that are entirely lopsided or entirely weird, non-traditional for either employees or advisors when they're coming in a little later. Do you give them a vesting schedule? Do you prohibit their token from trading? These are all little issues that come up with this transition from traditional fundraise to ICO. So having covered those 5 people-related questions that still apply to your company, no matter whether you've raised traditionally or through an ICO, there's some questions I couldn't fit into that I have left as outstanding questions. The first one is, how do you cover the marketing costs of an ICO? I've spoken to several companies that have raised ICOs recently, and all of them are telling me that the cost of raising a successful ICO is now nearing $1 million. Okay, so that means that now you're almost borderline having to raise venture funding in order to then do a successful ICO. So is the future of this really a blended thing where we're effectively doing part of the money coming from traditional venture and part of the money coming from ICO, or maybe the ICOs for expansion? So I don't think we have yet fully seen where this is going to end up. The other question is all the things having to do with governance. Forget regulation for a second, I don't want to go there. I'm just talking about governance within your network. How do you control the gaming of your tokens? You're not held hostage by the motivations of external parties. So for example, back to that advisor. That advisor joins your company. He's privy to some information. He's got the token. He's perfectly liquid on that token. It so happens that you just lost your CTO because you told him that you had to fire him because he was the first guy that joined your company, but in fact he doesn't scale up, so you now need to hire a new CTO. You were going to demote him as CPO. He doesn't like that, so he leaves. Your advisor has tokens. Now he feels like, you know what, this company isn't going anywhere. I'm going to sell my token. Other people know that he is who he is, so they sell their token too. Whereas traditionally, a company does not have the flexibility to have that level of liquidity at those hard times. A token-based economy for your equity holding or for your protocol company or whatever the organization that houses that value now may be at risk of some external agents manipulating it to their needs and rather your own needs. And of course, there's a lot of ways that this can be controlled, but the more and more we start controlling them, the more and more it starts mapping to traditional venture controls and governance. So as I mentioned, I have a podcast, podcast.seedcamp.com. Stay tuned for the Room to Read podcast, which launches tomorrow. I've had several on ICOs, some really notable people, and if you're really into the subject, you can follow it there. I also wrote a book called The Fundraising Field Guide, which walks you through how to raise a round. If you want to download it, it's free. It's on fundraisingfieldguide.com. And of course, you can go to my blog or to the Seedcamp website. And with that, I just want to thank you.
So, we have one question we'd like to ask you, and that is your general impression that startup industry is maturing, or do you think it's still in a rock star phase? Oh, good question. I
think this question needs to have a geographical slant to it. And I think that it varies depending on the geography. One of the interesting things about having been in this industry now for 11 years is that I've watched certain parts of Europe mature and go into this phase of growth and more complexity. And other parts of it still discovering its investor base and discovering who its first heroes are. And so each one of them is going to have a different set of dynamics. Separate to that, there is the rise of the successful founder that media has created across the world. And I think that is what's led to this sort of rock star phase. It doesn't matter where you go, it is now the default thing. It used to be that ex-MBAs or graduating MBAs wanted to be investment bankers or or management consultants, but now being a startup CEO is the sexy thing. And so I think that those two things are decoupled, you know, the maturing of an industry, and it varies by geography, and then there's this idea of a rock star, which I think is more cultural and where we are today, and sort of the me culture and me building my brand, rather than sort of working for this old, stodgy, top-down organization, which the data shows also doesn't lead to employee satisfaction.